There we go. We're good. So we are recording now, and I'd like to welcome everybody. And I just wanted to explain some of the logic behind this event, why we're having this event in the first place. I met with a group of water historians based out of the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History last summer. And there was talk, there was sort of an imagining of having several water history related events, events that would span different watersheds in the country. And as it goes with some of these things, there haven't been that many events yet, but there was an idea that we ought to organize something related to Muskrat Falls, even though this was recent history. And of course, that task fell to the one professor who was on the call that was from Newfoundland and Labrador, which was me. So I've been communicating. So then basically what happened is this amazing book came out, Muskrat Falls, How a Megadam Became a Predatory Formation, edited by Stephen Crocker and Lisa Moore. And it struck me right away that probably the most, not only the easiest way, but the most interesting panel that we could organize about Muskrat Falls would be populated by people who had recently collectively written a book on the subject. And it seemed that even if the subject is recent history, we're probably already at the point where it would be advantageous and valuable to reflect on that recent history in Newfoundland and Labrador, because there is a lot to think about. And obviously the project, though it's not actually, we're not actually receiving electricity from it yet, it does loom large in public discourse in this province. And I think it has lessons for mega projects that might be imagined in other places. So that was the logic behind the event. And obviously we are gathering virtually from many different places and different lands that have connections to different Indigenous nations. But I'm going to read out a land acknowledgement from Memorial that's actually designed for virtual events. But we are, I guess, since I'm hosting from the island of Newfoundland, it does reference Indigenous nations in this province. So we acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and Inuit of this province. I'd also like to thank several supporters of this event, the Nexus Center, who's helped us advertise and has been instrumental with some of the logistics around the event. So Sonia Boone, who is on the call right now, and her team at the Nexus Center have been super helpful. The Wilson Institute and Sarah Spike, who is a postdoc at the Wilson Institute, and her vision in putting together a water history group of connected historians across the country. And also our new Memorial University of Newfoundland Press, or MUN Press, the academic editor Fiona Pollock and staffer Randy Drover have been super supportive of this project. So I'm going to introduce each speaker in sequence. All of the speakers are authors of the book, but I thought we would start off with one of the editors who is going to introduce us to the book. Steve Crocker is an associate professor of sociology at Memorial University, specializing in social and political theory, media studies, and Newfoundland society and culture. He's the author of Bergson and the Metaphysics of Media, that came out with Palgrave in 2013, and of numerous essays and works in social theory and Newfoundland culture. So if you want to take it away, Steve, go for it.
Am I there for me now? Can you hear me, folks? Yes? Okay, good. Well, thank you, John. And thank you to Sonia as well, and to the Nexus Center. In fact, before I begin to talk about the book, just a couple of other thank yous to all of the contributors who contributed to the book. Thank you. Some of them who I've never met in person, I'm meeting here now. I'd also like to thank Fiona Pollock and Randy Drover and Alison Carr at Memorial University Press, who did, a quite amazing job in bringing the book together. There was, as you can imagine, a lot of work in bringing together a project like this, and it certainly could not have happened without all of their help, without Fiona's excellent editorial comments and help all along the way, Alison's organizational and production skills, and the work that Randy has done in marketing the book. So we are really grateful for the work that they did and their help in bringing it to life. Thank you, and to all the contributors. So I want to try not to take up too much time here. I thought I would just give a couple of comments about the book, where the book emerged from, some of the interests, some of the things that we wanted to address in the book, and just some general context for understanding it. And then I think other people will take up particular aspects of it. I'm imagining that everyone who has come here today has already some understanding of Muskrat Falls, what it is, but in case people don't, just very briefly, Muskrat Falls is a mega dam now nearing completion in Labrador. It's been a controversial project for more than a decade now. It has become well known for many problems, including massive cost overrun, engineering and technical problems, but more importantly, risks of methylmercury contamination and flooding for the people who live around the dam. The report of a year-long public inquiry described the Muskrat Falls project as a misguided project. In the public sphere in Newfoundland now, we see a continual public admission that the enterprise is not in our interests, that it poses a significant threat to the financial security of the province, to energy security, since it has doubled the price of electricity that's being artificially subsidized. We might want to talk about, but it certainly presents a threat to the financial security of the province, to the energy security of the province, to food security in Labrador. So many people now are distancing themselves from it. Players who had been involved in it, Kathy Dunderdale, for example, former premier, has said that she would not have sanctioned the project had she known then what she knows now, and so forth. So Muskrat Falls is an overcost, overrun project with many serious threats to the people who live around it and the people who have to pay for it. Lisa and I, we live in Newfoundland. We're learning the news about Muskrat Falls and concerned about it. We wanted to capture and respond to the threatening, predatory nature of the project, which became more and more confirmed as more information came known about it. And so we had the sense that this was a project that had turned on us, and we wanted to understand how it was that our own Crown agency, our own public institutions could create something that would diminish the public energy security and the health security of the province and present significant problems for all of us. So one thing that we recognize is that the logistics and the means, all of the various agencies and so forth that have helped to bring Muskrat Falls to life fit the profile of an increasingly familiar kind of crisis visible across Canada and really around the world today, in which public means of providing vital services and infrastructure, access to heat, water, food, security, are being changed everywhere into collateral for risky, speculative enterprises with often disastrous results. And that is exactly what's happening with Muskrat Falls. So we wanted to capture some of the multifaceted ways in which a project like this hits the ground and turns the river into a hydroelectric machine and the public electrical supply into a source of profits for private investors. The remarkable thing I found as a sociologist about Muskrat Falls is that the generation of value or money for investors in the project does not lie in the enterprise being funded. Muskrat Falls doesn't make commercial sense, and there is more and more confirmation of this all the time. The money being made in Muskrat Falls is made through access to publicly regulated revenue streams, regulated electrical rates that are controlled by the government. The logistics and means that unlock that value for investors, the operations, as Mazadra and Nielsen, who I quote in the book, describe it. The means that access that money and make it available to investors rely on the ability to undo whatever obstacles prevent the redirection of public money into a guaranteed source of debt payment. This is a critical situation. In this case, the freeing up of public revenue, the access to electrical revenues that could be increased and made available for investors, required things such as the weakening of public regulatory bodies, the failure to act on environmental recommendations, the refusal to use new scientific methods and data, the suppression of protest movements, the suppression of journalism, the arrest and prosecution of Indigenous protesters, and the authority ultimately given to Nalcor, a semi-privatized Crown corporation overseeing the project, to manage the many emerging social and environmental crises generated by that project. So again, as a sociologist, I was interested in the disturbing way that these developments tied together costs per unit of electricity on the island of Newfoundland with degrees of threat to food security on the Churchill River. Also I'm interested in the way that the interlocking of forms of predatory finance in this project and environmental threats in Labrador called into being new kinds of alliances of people concerned about these threats and responding to them. New kinds of alliances among people concerned about Indigenous rights, food security, environmental safety, public health, threats to public governance, the dismantling of public regulatory bodies, press freedom groups, and people concerned with energy security, alternative energy, who all saw in this project a threat to common public good. So Muskrat Falls, I would say, came into existence not because it made good sense, not because it made good sense as an energy security project, not because it made good sense as a financial project, but because of the ability of Nalcor, the police, and the provincial and federal government to push back against that wave of resistance and to silence it. We thought it was important to understand and record this wave of refusal and resistance to this threatening predatory formation, as we call it in the book, following the work of Saskia Sassan. And in terms of the book, we thought that it would be useful not only to people here who are trying to understand the impact of this dam on life here, but to many other people in many other places faced by similar predatory forces that threaten their infrastructural security. We recognize that a project like this produces many different kinds of problems and dislocations. I've mentioned some of these earlier in financial security, public, energy security, and so on. So we wanted to bring together an interesting book that would unite the scientific and technical information that would be necessary to have to understand the dam, but with also other kinds of response to the crisis, representation of the crisis as well. We wanted to involve not only academics and scientists, but other people, writers, journalists, social activists, people who were engaged in, again, resistance to and representation of that crisis. Finally, we thought that Muskrat Falls has all sorts of implications for other infrastructural security problems around the world as well. But also, I think that Muskrat Falls tells us a powerful lesson about the nature of democracy and what makes it thrive and what makes it wither. In this particular context now, in a post-pandemic world that we're moving into, we can see that one of the things that we learned from the pandemic is that we live in a world that is becoming increasingly unpredictable, environmentally, financially, politically, microbially, etc. And the pandemic has showed us that what we need are good, secure, strong public institutions to protect us against those threats. Muskrat Falls seems to be a paradigm example of exactly the opposite of undoing public security, public provisions that have been built up over a very long history in the province, dismantling those in order to open up the public electrical system as a source of investment for investors that ultimately undermines public security here in the province. So those are some of the things that we wanted to address in the book. We wanted to bring together the kind of, we want to represent and give a depiction of this toxic relationship that was forming between electrical pricing on the island of Newfoundland and degrees of threat to Labrador, and to provide a more global context for understanding that and make those results available to people in an interesting way. I would say that would be my description of what the book is about.
All right, thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I should say, I did not say in the opening comments, I mean, the book is itself a fascinating, interdisciplinary examination of Muskrat Falls. It does everything, it ranges from art to science and everything in between. And so I thought we would start off hearing from both of the editors. So next in the roundtable, we're going to hear from Lisa Moore, who is a celebrated writer based in Newfoundland. She's written numerous books, including collections of short stories. The titles are Degrees of Nakedness, Open, and Something for Everyone. And then 3 novels, Alligator, February, and Caught, as well as a stage play based on the novel February. She has been nominated and won a raft of literary awards, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but highlights of in terms of the ones she's won, it includes the Writers' Trust Angle Findlay Award for Fiction, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the Canadian Caribbean region. She won the Alistair MacLeod Prize for Short Fiction and the Thomas Rattle Atlantic Fiction Award. She is a professor of creative writing at Memorial University and was also active, if you read her essay in the book, in the protests against Muskrat Falls. So I'll turn things over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, John. I just want to make sure that my sound is okay. Does it sound good? Okay. And thank you to all of the people that Steve thanked. It was a tremendous honor to get to work on this book. I'm so grateful to Memorial Press and to Fiona and Randy for publishing it, but to all of the contributors, because it makes the book really an interdisciplinary an in-depth study of Muskrat Falls. I'm going to talk about my own contribution. My contribution looks at several artists in the province who have responded to the hydroelectric dam, and also ways in which the dam was represented in popular culture. I did close readings of this work, and I was particularly interested in the ways duration or time was represented in these pieces, and the idea of inevitability. And just to sort of explain a little bit what I'm talking about, I'm going to give one instance. I looked at a CBC News video clip. This was a piece of popular culture. It was a tweet posted by the journalist Katie Breen, and it was 45 seconds in length, so that's very short. In it, we see a RCMP vehicle, which is transporting Inuk land protector Beatrice Hunter from the courthouse to prison, to the prison system. We cannot see Hunter in the video. In fact, all we see is an RCMP wagon nosing its way through a chain link fence, and it's barely moving. It's just the nose of this vehicle, this RCMP vehicle. The video clip goes by very quickly, of course, because it's only 45 seconds, but the content is really slow to unfold. And I was interested in that contrast. Nothing is happening. But as the viewers, as viewers are trained in watching cinema, we know that something is inevitable. Something is definitely going to happen if we keep watching. And so we experience that lack of movement as a kind of suspense. That's the way we're trained to read film and video. As the pacing drags, the tension builds. The subject of the video is delay. That is the subject of the video, delay. The form becomes the content. An urgency coalesces in that stillness. Now, the scholar Anne Laura Stoller says that duress, because I'm also talking about duress. that duress is tethered to time, but rarely in any predictable way. It may be a response to relentless force, to quickening pacing of pressure, to intensified or arbitrary inflictions that reduce expectation or stamina. And here I think we can think about the stamina required to be a social activist and to face the courts. So at the very last minute of this 45-second video, the camera swings and the tweet reveals land protectors lying on the ground, stopping the movement of the RCMP vehicle. They're just lying, they're lined up, bodies on the ground. They're putting their bodies on the line here to stop that vehicle, to protect the water and the land. And I'm interested in the duress and the duration, also in terms of the schedule the government proposed for the development of this dam. The insistence on that schedule, on the timing of each development of the dam. And they felt that that schedule had to be adhered to no matter what. And they were involved in the inevitability of the completion of the dam. It was always inevitable once it had been, this was the narrative that the government supported, that it was always inevitable, that once it began, there was no way to stop it, almost as though there were no human agency in the developing of the dam. Visual artist Billy Gauthier went on a hunger strike in order to advocate for the clearing of vegetation from the flooding site. It was a hunger strike to clear the vegetation in order to mitigate or slow down the production of methylmercury in the water. And here, duration mattered very much. His life was at stake. The government waited until the 13th day of his hunger strike, along with two other hunger strikers, before calling a very dramatic emergency meeting that went on till after midnight. So here, even the government is exploiting a kind of drama in the time. It must go on until midnight, after which the government promised to clear the vegetation away before flooding. But they broke that promise. And before the flooding occurred, they did not clear away the vegetation. And the reason Minister Andrew Parsons announced was that they, quote, missed the deadline. So it was a deadline of their own making. They made it seem as though the deadline had come from outside. It was a question of duration, of timing, of duress. And I just want to close with just a beautiful, talk about a beautiful piece of work by, well, all of Billy Gauthier's sculpture is incredibly beautiful, but this particular piece is called Swimming Loons. One of his curators describes Billy Gauthier as a magician with materials, and he truly is, because he uses traditional materials, Inuit materials for sculpting, such as bone and baleen and antler, but he carves these materials to, and especially in this Swimming Loons sculpture, which is really a masterpiece, and it is, it's a technical, the technical skill involved is awe-inspiring, because he carves this antler to the point of translucence, but also to the point of fragility and to a near cracking. So it seems to me that the very material is a beautiful metaphor for where we are environmentally in this moment of climate crisis. The loons are very playful, and it appears that their heads are dipping underwater where they can meet as they swim on the surface. That's the way the sculpture looks. It took me a day of contemplating that, sculpture, or perhaps even longer, to recognize that this playfulness was overshadowed by the possibility that the water that these loons were represented in might have been full of methylmercury, and they may have been poisoned. So that's what I was talking about in my contribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And when my sister was visiting out of town just before the pandemic, she saw the Billy Gautier exhibit at the rooms, and then went back to see it again the next day. That's how blown away she was. So it's super powerful stuff, and I'm sure you can find images online. Our next presenter is Niri Alward, and she holds an MPhil in development studies from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. And her master's thesis was titled Eat Less Fish, ironic title, Hydropower, Citizenship, and Nature in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The Eat Less Fish was a quote from the member of the House of Assembly for my riding, Nick Whalen. Anyways, the thesis examined settler representations of Labrador and the Muskrat Falls project. Aylward also worked with Solidarity with Labrador Land Protectors to mobilize settler resources and support for land protectors facing legal action. And her essay in the book was dealt with the subject of industrial colonization. So I'm going to turn it over to Neria.
Hello, thank you so much. And this is it's so many of you I haven't seen in so long. So that's another reason that this is a lovely panel to be a part of. I will speak quite briefly. I wrote this essay during my master's. I've since, I'm not really in academia anymore for lots of reasons, but kind of that, I'd like to just speak kind of more generally to the impact that these kinds of narratives have on settler Newfoundlanders and how those kind of carry through. I mean, I think for me that, and I write this in the chapter, that this investigation was quite a personal one more than anything. I'm here today, like really, I live in Newfoundland and Labrador now. I live in St. John's. And I think I live with many of the same questions that I was kind of motivated by when I was writing my master's, which is really, how do you live in this province? And do so in a bit of a gentler way, and how do we start building those networks of solidarity that we're going to need in order to live differently in this province. So I was, I think for many of us, at least a lot of us settlers who live in St. John's, we can kind of pinpoint the time when we started to learn about Muskrat Falls. And for me, I was about 20 years old, and I was seeing it happening through the Independent, and I'm sure Justin will speak much more to that. The Independent was doing all this live streaming, and I remember being really just like really baffled by it. I was really confused. I didn't understand, and because Muskrat Falls, it had kind of been happening in the background of growing up in the province, and I had a sense of kind of what it was, and that it was ostensibly, this was all for my benefit, that this was happening, future generations and all that. And then seeing on the other hand, I had my burgeoning sense of social justice and kind of starting to understand, maybe the Indigenous histories of our province, and seeing what was happening in Labrador and not being able to square the two. I think ultimately because they can't really be squared in a way that's productive and that's just. But what I learned about, what I then did my master's on is really looking at how I learned about Labrador, how I came to know the things that I did know, and the tools that I was equipped with. And anyone who grew up in this province knows that we are subjected to just like endless history and social studies lessons about like the history of Newfoundland and wooden boats and the cod fishery and the truck system and the merchants and all these things and the logging, and we'd learned so much about the province. Like we just didn't stop learning about it. World War I, World War II, and yet I had no real tools to imagine a different kind of future from the one that we were experiencing now. So in this presentation, I'm kind of just going to do two things pretty quickly and talk about what I did in my master's. I basically looked at the memoirs of politicians over the decades in this province since Confederation, and how they talked specifically about Churchill Falls. And then I'm going to give you some quotes because you'll never read I would wish on nobody reading these memoirs. And so I'll give you the highlights because these quotes are really spectacular and they're very sad in many ways. And then, in the hopes that these texts can give us some clues, because in looking at what we have come to know, we can start to deconstruct that and to build solidarity across social movements in this province, social movements for decolonization, for decarbonization, and also for social justice. And I think that we need to understand really well how we know what we know, not just what we know and erase it, but kind of understanding what underpins that. So in reading these memoirs, I really focused on there's enough in there about hydropower. There's enough in there about Labrador and Muskrat and the Churchill River or the Hamilton River or the Grand River, depending on who you ask. And so first of all, what shows up really big is in talking about Labrador is that Newfoundlanders are oppressed. We don't actually talk that much about Labrador itself. We talk about how it represents the oppression of Newfoundlanders. And John Crosbie, who was like a pretty famous Newfoundland politician, he has a whole chapter in his book titled The Rape of Newfoundland, where he's actually talking about Labrador and Churchill Falls. And it's pretty jarring, that kind of language, how bluntly the gendered implications of that, the colonial implications of that. So, Labrador is the symbol of Newfoundland, of everything that's wrong with the way that Newfoundland is in the world. And I think I'll pull out a quote because O'Brien Beckford, who was one of our premiers, who's now like really gone down this weird alt-right kind of journey for himself. So hate that for him. But anyways, when he's writing about here at this mining conference that he's at in Quebec. And where did this quote go? I will find it in a second. Yeah, so he's talking about this mining conference that he's in Quebec and talking about the border between Labrador City and Quebec, and between Labrador and Quebec, and he looked up in the lobby and there was this map and it was of Quebec, but there was no Labrador boundary. And he said, I blew my top. I immediately complained to the people at the desk, went to my room, called to see where the minister was. Within a short period of time, spoke to him. So he's just talking about how he got all angry and called the manager. I indicated that in no uncertain terms that this brazen display was unacceptable, and we would have to withdraw from the conference if this map remained on display, that I would hold a press conference announcing our withdrawal and why. The map was quickly removed. So it's all about, if you go through his memoirs, he doesn't talk much about Labrador except to show how he made this point about who Newfoundlanders are. And the second thing is that nature really is a place of struggle. And in looking at kind of nature as a site of struggle, and specifically Labrador and the people who live there, and the Innu and the Inuit who have lived there for so long are completely erased, and their ideas about what the land represents. And so this is all very obvious to Labradorians. As a settler, it's like, look at the way that Labrador is talked about. It's super obvious, but to a settler Canadian from St. John's, it might not be so straightforward. And, I think looking back that I might have come to very similar conclusions and picked out pretty similar things had I looked at many other kinds of media from the same time period. If you looked at films or you looked at proceedings from the House of Assembly, but even today, if you look at Newfoundland and Labrador tourism ads, you could learn a lot of the same things. And looking to where we are today, where there's this kind of consensus that Muskrat Falls was a bad idea. But the inquiry really was all about how it was a bad idea because it cost so much. And that doesn't actually really help us understand. That's a valuable exercise, certainly, but it doesn't do much to help us understand what the Labrador land protectors were doing. I don't think they were putting their bodies on the line because it cost too much. There were other things there, obviously, at play. And it's that, this kind of inquiry about how much it all costs, it doesn't really help us build solidarity and protect lands going forward, because provided that it's profitable, according to the logics of the inquiry and kind of the current public discourse around the project, it's okay as long as it's still profitable. And I think that really speaks to how deeply these narratives are held. I'm going to wrap up there. I look forward to hearing from everyone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Neria. And just a couple of thoughts as you were speaking. And I'm just going to make Ryan a presenter, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But you alluded to the connection to Newfoundland nationalism, and there's a great essay that came out, a number of years ago now, by Jerry Bannister, Jerry with a J, and on the connection between Newfoundland nationalism and the Muskrat Falls Dam, that it was meant to right the wrongs of the Churchill Falls Dam, and that was in Acadiensis. And so if you have connection to a university library, you can look that up if you want to further your reading, in addition to this book. And in terms of the impacts of dams on Indigenous people, a book that's made quite a splash recently is Brittany Luby's Damned, which details the impacts of the Norman Dam and the White Dog Falls Generating Station in northwestern Ontario. It is a lovely book. So if you're looking to get a suite of books about mining, you can do no wrong by getting this book about Muskrat Falls, but maybe you can even get a reduced price deal on whoever your book vendor is if you buy it in conjunction with Brittany Luby's book. But I want to introduce Ryan, who's going to bring in a little bit of a perspective on some of the environmental impacts that Neria alluded to. He was part of a research team who in 2016 issued a report that raised new concerns about the threat of methylmercury contamination from the Muskrat Falls Dam. Ryan Calder is an assistant professor in the environmental health program at Virginia Tech. And we're really happy to have him here all the way from Virginia, I'm assuming. I guess you could be anywhere, but welcome, Ryan, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I am in Roanoke, Virginia right now. Could I don't know what format you had in mind, but is it okay to invite clarifying questions while I'm speaking, or would you prefer questions to be postponed until the end?
We can, if somebody has a point of clarification or a clarifying question, they can send a chat to me, and I'll monitor the chat while you're talking.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, yeah.
Cool, so I guess I just wanted to talk a bit about the methylmercury issue and describe how we got involved in this project. So hydroelectric development, the development of reservoirs, is widely known to be associated with the production of methylmercury, which is a neurotoxin in flooded soils. And methylmercury is produced in the soil and works its way through the food chain, and that has obvious implications for people who eat a lot of local seafood, in particular indigenous populations. And in the setting of Muskrat Falls, there was a risk assessment done for the reservoir environment, but Nalcor's contention was that there would be no downstream impacts. And so there was no need to do a risk assessment for the Labrador Inuit, whose traditional lands are downstream from the actual project footprint around Lake Melville, which is, it's not really a lake, it's an estuary, but they call it Lake Melville, and that drains into the Atlantic Ocean. And so this raises the obvious question, if you don't do a risk assessment, how do you know that there are no risks? So it's a little bit of circular reasoning. And this alarmed the Labrador Inuit, represented by the Nunatsiavut government, obviously, because there had been well-known downstream impacts from Churchill Falls in the 60s. And so that led them to reach out to Elsie Sunderland, who became my PhD advisor at Harvard, saying basically, like, Nalcor says that the risks are zero to us, but that seems weird based on what we know from Churchill Falls. Can you take a look at this, basically? And so that set the stage for what became my PhD project. And we basically developed a biogeochemical model to evaluate the range of possible impacts of Muskrat Falls on methylmercury levels in the Churchill River and in Lake Melville and local biota. And then we did a human health risk assessment where we basically worked with the Nunatsiavut government to recruit 1,145 Inuit settled around Lake Melville, measured their baseline mercury exposures and characterized their intake of local foods. And then we basically multiplied those two numbers together to evaluate the range of possible impacts on methylmercury exposures. And we found that for a small number, but definitely non-zero number of people that eat a relatively high amount of local food, they were likely to be, at peak exposures, likely to be pushed over the Health Canada reference dose for methylmercury into kind of levels of legitimate health concern. And that came out in 2016. That obviously caused a lot of local consternation and concern, and the government eventually agreed to convene an independent expert advisory committee. that had delegates from the local Indigenous populations, the Innu Nation, the Nunatsiavut government, and local municipalities, as well as independent scientists from Environment Canada and elsewhere, to basically go through all of the totality of the scientific characterizations, both our work and consulting work that had been done a few years earlier on behalf of Nalcor, to evaluate whether it would be prudent to undertake remedial action before the reservoir was developed. And I suspect the government expected the committee to find that our science was bad and that there was no need to do anything, but they actually voted to undertake remedial action because they saw that even when you combine the biogeochemical forecasts by Nalcor with our human health numbers, there's still a risk. So the risk that we found was not so much on the biogeochemical side. The risk that we found was taking account of the range of intake of local food, which on the part of the Labrador Inuit, which there were no other available numbers for. And so the Independent Expert Advisory Committee voted for remedial action. And as we heard earlier, the government just sat on that recommendation until they missed the deadline, which, like, the deadline, they invented the deadline. So it seems like kind of a made up excuse to me, but that's my opinion. And then the reservoir was impounded, and now we're all waiting to see how the numbers come out. Also, I should point out that one finding that we made that was kind of lost in the discussion was that for most people, the benefits of eating local food still outweigh the risks, especially for the Labrador Inuit who have high rates of food insecurity. Access to traditional foods is really important for nutritional security. And the benefits, there are material benefits of fish and other seafood that at relatively low exposures to methylmercury can exceed the risks. And so that's been a very challenging scientific message to communicate. To, on the one hand, like, clearly communicate that Muskrat Falls will, like, unequivocally reduce the benefits of local food for everyone, and will maybe for some people present net risks. And that is an effect that I think Nalcor and the government ought to own up to, while also communicating the importance of maintaining access to traditional diets and local foods. And so that's been a hard scientific message to communicate. And so I guess those are the points that I wanted to raise. So I'll leave it there. I don't know if there are any clarifying questions or if you want to wait until the end.
There's nothing came through on the chat at this point. So yeah, we can wait till the end. And thanks, Ryan. And as you say, I think everybody's waiting for new numbers, new studies to come out. I think one of the big unanswered questions as I was reading the book is what is actually going to happen in terms of mercury contamination in that region. And you know, the points you raise about food insecurity are bound to be even more salient now with rising fuel prices, which is going to increase shipping costs and general inflation of food costs. A problem that's only going to get worse because of the Ukraine war and other global factors. So thank you for putting that into perspective. Our last two panelists are going to talk about resistance. And some of the protests movements. First up, we have Justin Brake, and he is an independent journalist based in the Bay of Islands, Newfoundland. He's a contributing editor at The Breach and an investigative reporter for The Independent, where he served as the editor from 2012 to 2017. And if you'll allow me an indulgence, he was many years ago, I can't even remember how many years ago, but when I started here, a student in one of my classes, and definitely an awesome guy to teach. and I've been watching his career develop over time, and you know, certainly was flushed and flooded with admiration at the stance he took defending press freedom in relation to covering protest movements in Canada. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin and let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, John. Appreciate that. You can hear me fine? Okay, great. I appreciate this opportunity to chat, and also just to chat today, but also to be a part of this book, which I wish I could have contributed more to in terms of the written content. It was very difficult to put down in words where I was at the time when I was asked by Lisa and Steve to contribute something, because my thoughts and feelings on journalism and the role of journalism in the whole Muskrat Falls fiasco has been evolving, you know, quite rapidly since 2016. I just want to begin, if I can indulge myself, I just want to begin with my own sort of, I guess, land acknowledgement. I don't even like the term land acknowledgement anymore, because they've been sort of used in all kinds of different ways. But I am speaking to everyone here today from the Bay of Islands, which is on the west coast of the island, and it is the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Beothuk. And you know, the reason I want to say that is because it is the genocide and extinction of the Beothuk that all of us on the west coast and across this province benefit from today, as we own property and raise our families here. And I just wanted also to preface my few minutes here by saying that in 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls published a very long and compelling evidence-based case for the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And that's a finding that, of course, several national media outlets publicly denounced, refuted, denied, without having even read the report the day that finding was made public, and which media have largely ignored in the intervening years, the 3 years since then. So the erasure and the continued colonization of Indigenous peoples and lands continues today in Canada, including here in this province. And I'll come back to that. But first, I also would like to humbly request that that everybody join me just in a moment of silence to remember a few individuals who were instrumental in the Indigenous-led and the anti-colonial resistance to Muskrat Falls over a number of years, but particularly in 2016, when I spent some time in Labrador. They were all very kind to me, gave me their time. And they're no longer with us, and their departures, I think, represent enormous losses to their families, of course, their communities, and to the wider struggle for Indigenous liberation. They are Jim Learning, Bart Jack Sr., D.M. Saunders, and Ken Mesher, who is known to many in Labrador affectionately as Uncle Ken Mesher. So if we could just take a few seconds just to remember them and the sacrifices that they made for us. This past January, in this province, Crown prosecutors dropped charges against 9 prison guards at Her Majesty's Penitentiary, charges of manslaughter and negligence causing death in the case of Jonathan Penhack from Nain. In November 2019, Jonathan, who is an Inuk man and father from Nain, was involved in an altercation with guards at the St. John's prison. His head was covered in a spit hood and his arms and legs were shackled to restrain him. He was left in a segregation cell, and he was later found unresponsive, dead. A forensic pathologist reviewed the prison footage of the incident and other evidence and determined that he had died of traumatic asphyxiation. People who knew him have noted publicly in news reports that he suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome, and that various systems, from our healthcare system to education to the justice system, failed him throughout his life. But when the Crown finally decided that it couldn't proceed with the charges against the guards, the province and the world were told, in the lead of a story from our national broadcaster, that the 9, and this is a quote, the 9 St. John's prison guards embroiled in a jailhouse death case and accused of killing an inmate under their care can now breathe freely for the first time in more than 2 years. Indigenous people haven't breathed freely for 500 years, and we treat their ongoing subjugation to the systemic and state violence, which we've already noted amounts to a form of genocide, as if it were just another story in the daily news cycle. It's not just another story. It's the very reason the rest of us have lives, families, communities, and relative freedom on these lands. And as I write in my short essay in this book, journalists and journalism have played an instrumental role in facilitating settler colonialism. Our so-called objectivity has been an illusion and an excuse for stereotyping, misrepresenting, or outright erasing Indigenous peoples. And detailed research and scores of evidence show us that this is not a debatable fact. So for journalists, it's the ultimate dilemma and a conflict of interest. If I'm being honest, if we acknowledge the realities of settler colonialism, we can only find ourselves on one side of the story as beneficiaries of systems that we prop up through our work, that we support, and then that we then benefit from. And what we're left with is a question for those, I think a growing number of journalists are kind of asking these questions or on maybe a similar journey, but we're left with the question of what is the path forward, of not only how we begin to redress the violence that we participate in and perpetuate, but of how to decolonize journalism more broadly, if that's even possible. And thanks to frank conversations that I've had the privilege to work with many Indigenous journalists from across the country, and conversations with friends and other colleagues. My thoughts on decolonizing journalism have evolved quite a bit since I've written this essay. Some of them I wrote were published about a year ago in Briar Patch magazine, and I'm happy to share a link to that, where I picked the brains of several Indigenous journalists and activists and scholars to talk about this very topic. And that evolution of thinking and understanding has led me to a point where I can look back on my reporting from 2016. When I was in Labrador, I spent 5 to 6 weeks in Labrador at the time as the resistance was ramping up ahead of the anticipated reservoir flooding. And I can see all kinds of problems with my reporting, not the least of which was a failure to situate the sovereign Innu Nation's role in the development of the dam in a more accurate and appropriate anti-colonial context. So as such, today I am continuing to educate myself on the histories of Innu and Inuit communities in Labrador, so that in the course of my work as a journalist in this province, I can continue developing my storytelling in ways that contribute to decolonization rather than colonization. And I don't think that these sorts of educational processes for journalists to research or learn about an issue, or these aren't like one-time or isolated efforts. They require a lot of personal work and introspection, collaborative work, and difficult conversations, and perhaps even a willingness to accept that if we aren't willing ourselves or able to do this work properly, maybe we're in the wrong profession. Just a desire to tell stories alone, I don't think, is enough to be a journalist in the world that we're living in today. And so all of that said, I think and I hope that by live broadcasting, some of the most acute moments of the historical and ongoing resistance to colonial encroachment on Innu and Inuit lands in what's now called Labrador, I hope that the Independent opened a door in people's minds and hopefully a willingness to stand and work in solidarity with Innu and Inuit to determine paths and means to Indigenous liberation and sovereignty for their communities. I think I'll leave it at that for now, if that's all right.
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. And we have one last panelist, and as I always like to say, certainly the last is not the least. And I'm super excited to hear from Jessica Penney, who is a Nunatsiavut Inuk researcher with family from Rigolet, Nunatsiavut, and Carbonear in Newfoundland, Labrador. She was raised in Iqaluit in Nunavut, and her PhD research in sociology, which occurred at the University of Glasgow, study the well-being and social impacts of the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric project on Inuit and Rigolet and how these issues are linked to global structures. Her master's in global health dissertation focused on the experiences of Labrador land protectors in resisting the Muskrat Falls project. And Jessica is also a research associate at the Qualjigal. Do you want to pronounce that, Jessica? I'm stumbling on that pronunciation.
It's the Qayugartit Health Research Center.
Okay, thanks. In Iqaluit, and she's passionate about Inuit research ethics and methodologies. So welcome, Jessica.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you to the rest of the presenters. It's been really interesting hearing all of your different works again. So I'm actually going to share some slides just because I have some quotes from land protectors that I want to share, and I think it can be quite impactful visually. So let me just get that up. So I'll also speak very briefly, about 5 minutes or so, just sharing a little bit about this work, which, as John described, was from my master's thesis. So it's a few years ago now. But I'll be discussing my work, which is from chapter 2 of the book on exploring the health and well-being concerns of the Labrador land protectors. And as John said, this emerged out of my master's in global health research, which was in summer 2018. And I worked with the Labrador land protectors on this. And I like to say that I worked with them to acknowledge the contributions of the Labrador land protectors within this work. As most of you will probably know, they were really key organizers in the resistance movement against the Muskrat Falls project. And you'll also note throughout my slides that the quotes that I use have names associated with them. And this was an intentional choice that myself and the land protectors made to acknowledge the origins of the knowledge that was shared, and just know that consent was given for that to be the case. And so I came to this work from, as someone whose family is from Labrador, and really the resistance efforts at the Muskrat Falls project caught my eye as a kind of really unprecedented and collaborative efforts that were obviously in the news at the time and really felt very impactful to me personally, but also as someone studying health and social issues at that time, the concerns piqued my interest around injustices related to health and well-being. And so my kind of aim in doing this research and when writing the book chapter was to think about and explore a comprehensive picture of the health concerns that were being raised. And so that's what I'll try to highlight here, including hopefully a few extra insights and background and details about how I'm moving the work forward as well. So one of the main things that of course was discussed that most people are probably familiar with is the work and the issue of the methylmercury concerns. So informed by the work of the Nunavut government and university researchers, including Dr. Calder and his colleagues. And so a lot of people in the research that I did raised this issue, of course. And I think, of course, there's a risk to physical health, but also it was really described to me how there's a sense of disruption in a way of life that goes beyond the physical health aspect and leads to potential discussions around the impact to food systems and also the emotional and mental health benefits of traditional foods and their impact on identity. So I'll just read a couple of quotes here by land protectors. So Marjorie Flowers described how the Muskrat Falls project has affected me spiritually and emotionally. And of course, the threat of being physically, affected by methylmercury, because my life is on the land, my life is of the water, my life is, country food. And Linda Saunders also described her perspective about how the thing about being able to go down the land or go fishing or something, there's like a natural healing there. And being able to, get away from the stress of work or home and just get out there. Even if it's like 25 below and you go out on the ice and fish, you feel that rejuvenation of health. So beyond the impact of methylmercury on physical health as a neurotoxin, there is a real threat to people's conceptualization of their life and their lifestyle and their well-being in a more holistic sense. And so the second issue that I wanted to discuss and that I write about in the book is that of the North Spur stability. And so that is informed by the work of Drs. Bernander and Elfgren in the book as well, but also by traditional and experiential knowledge of the land around the Grand River by people who live there. And so people talked about being concerned about themselves and their friends and their family who live in what's called the flood zone in Goose Bay, if the North Spur were to be damaged or to collapse. And Sam Saunders described how he's seen landslides all along the riverbank, right down from the mouth of the river right up to Churchill Falls. And when he was trapping one winter, he saw a landslide in the wintertime, and it was not good. And Eldred said, "I know people are going to bed frightened. I've heard of people getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they get up and get dressed and they see if the river's rising." So really there was a real sense of a distress associated with not trusting the North Spur portion of the hydro project and how that impacts people's lives. And so if we think about these issues together and as part of people's lives more holistically, there is really a sense of questioning longstanding knowledge that has been communicated over generations. And so I think this quote by the late Jim Learning really describes that quite well. He was speaking to me about methylmercury, but I think it applies to a whole range of issues, and says, "It's put what was a secure food supply in question. And that's a psychological factor that you now have to overcome. You either ignore it or try to tone down your expectations of the proteins you're getting from it. That becomes a question. So yes, that's the impact of that in my world. Changes your perception of the safety that was. It's gone." So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, and very happy to discuss further. But in thinking about where the work has gone since then, I am, as John described in my bio, continuing similar work on the Muskrat Falls project in the community of Riglet. And this was based on the encouragement of Labrador land protectors who told me, there's more work to be done, there's more people to speak to. And so I'm finding some similarities there, but also differences based on the community's unique lifestyle and geographical features of the area. And perhaps also linked to what Dr. Calder was speaking about, focusing on health risk communication strategies for the issues associated with the Muskrat Falls project. So part of my research is focusing on how environmental issues intersect with health and well-being, but also how we can develop policies and procedures to help people feel informed and that they understand potential risks and are able to make the best health decisions possible for themselves. And so that's what I'm working on right now. And yes, I'm happy to discuss further in the discussion section. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, and thanks to all the panelists. I just quick comment, what the quote from Jim Learning about, when the land is sick, it makes the people feel in a way sick, or that they can't trust the land anymore. That's something that in my mining research we heard time and again, or we saw documented in various forums that happen, like in relation to arsenic contamination in Yellowknife. It's this idea that the land we've relied on is sick, and it just we can't trust that which had sustained us, and that that is an overwhelming feeling for a lot of people in response to those kinds of contamination issues. So what I'm doing right now, I'd like to thank Jessica and all the panelists. I'm making everybody a panelist right now, so that in keeping with the desire of the actual panel, we wanted to have a bit more of an open conversation. So just in terms of the ground rules for that, I just wanted to have everybody to keep your mic muted. Obviously, this is the kind of the standard stuff we've all been dealing with since our lives were dominated by video calls. If you want to ask a question, as I said before, you can hit me up in the chat. And I just wanted to say there's one person I seem to not be able to make a panelist, and there's a lock sign behind their names. So you may have your settings so that I can't make you a panelist, and that's fine. If you don't want to do that, that's fine with me. But you'll have to, I think, have to make an adjustment at your end. But even if you're not in the panelist mode, you can send me a question in the chat, and I'll monitor that. So if there are people who want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand, or you can just say question in the chat. So Adrian Tanner, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I've always wondered why closer attention wasn't paid during the early development stages to what was also happening in Quebec. I was part of a group that protested and opposed the Great Whale River project, which was actually cancelled. It wasn't directly cancelled due to but I'm sure our team intervention, mainly with the Cree of James Bay, so many issues. And the other thing is, the way this project would have been stopped was at the environmental impact stage. I remember the land protectors coming to St. John's around that stage and making a very weak, in my view, non-starter type of presentation. In other words, what I'm saying is not only was there so much incompetence at the level of the proponents and the engineers and everybody else involved in promoting this project, but we didn't learn very much about how to stop these kinds of projects. The way most of these issues the really serious issues were brought up after environmental approval had been given. And at that stage, I know it's easy to say, but it really is very difficult to stop a project once money has been spent and you know, the spades are in the ground and that. You're just fighting a losing battle to try and stop it at that stage. So we should learn from this disaster how future projects that are need to be stopped. That's just I wonder how the panelists feel about that.
Okay, so it's an open question. So does anybody want to jump in on that? Maybe just raise your hand and take it away. Okay, Ryan.
Yeah, I agree with Adrian that I think there's a need for tools that can screen. So we're very good at screening sites for development in terms of economic viability. The model for environmental impact assessment and human health impact assessment is basically like, once we've decided on a site to develop for whether it's hydroelectricity or something else, everything else becomes about mitigation. And so this is bad for human health. It's also bad for the economic viability of these projects, because you end up, in most cases, you end up spending more money fighting communities than you would have spent on the front end trying to identify a site that would cause less conflict and less harm to communities. So there's definitely a need for scientific tools, and also to reimagine how we conduct environmental and human health risk assessment to make it more of a screening activity rather than a mitigation activity.
And Steve, you had your hand up. Did you want to?
Yeah, yes, it's an excellent question, Adrian. I wanted to point out that one of the things you see in the story of Muskrat Falls is how very small incremental changes have a large cumulative And so early on in this project, when it was removed from the oversight of the Public Utilities Board, that was, in some ways, a smaller operation than the federal provincial.
Steve, sorry to interrupt. You're breaking up, at least from my end. I'm wondering if usually the solution to that is maybe try going without video.
Beautiful to hear. Apologies. Stop video. Is the audio any better now?
That's much better, yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to say that one of the things that we see in the project is that small incremental changes along the way have an accumulative, larger dramatic effect later on. And in this project, removal of it from the utilities board was in some sense, a less dramatic change than levels between federal and provincial environmental joint review and interpretation of those documents. It had an enormous impact in the ability to tie together environmental concerns and financing. Before the final financing was sanctioned in 2012, the head of the Public Utilities Board wrote to Jim Farragut, the finance minister, saying that it should be sanctioned because of ongoing concerns, including environmental concerns, and that had no significance because the board had no to be able to act on that. So a little lesson in democracy there, that small institutions like local public utilities boards have enormous consequence as these projects move forward and continue to go on. Just wanted to make that point.
Steve, I got a bit of the gist of that. I'm not sure how it's coming through for other people, but yeah, I would, on the next answer, I would try maybe with video off, and then, yeah. And it might come through clear.
Sorry.
Lisa. Whoop, you're muted, Lisa.
Sorry. I think what Steve was saying, I'm guessing, is, and thank you, Adrian, for that that question, was that with the dismantling of the Public Utility Board, and Steve, you can correct me if I'm wrong with your camera off, it became difficult to take into account what the government was doing, and there was a tremendous amount of obfuscation and out and loud untruths. So it was difficult to jump on this at the beginning. Maybe more difficult than in earlier times, maybe not, but it felt like there was a lot of repression of the truth, really.
So maybe I'll open it up. Does anybody else have a question? Another question as the clock ticks toward the top of the hour.
I have a question, but I'll wait to see if an attendee has a question.
Sure. Oh, sorry, did you want to go ahead, Steve?
Sure, yeah. I wanted to ask Ryan if you could give us some sort of update on methylmercury in Lake Melville. Now I know there has been some news stories over the last year about differing accounts of accumulating levels of methylmercury production in that area. And I think that you've had a difference of opinion with McCarthy, I think is one of the scientists who had argued that the level acceptable. You say that there's indications that they are moving toward a concerning level. Could you just give us a kind of a brief sense of where that stands today?
Yeah, so the pulse of methyl, so how it works basically is that after flooding, there's a pulse of methylmercury and levels increase and then they decline, and then that kind of reverberates through the food system. The government has been doing water column monitoring and publishing the data, and the water column results were within our 95% confidence interval. So we consider the forecast for peak levels to have been, I guess you could say, confirmed, in the sense that they were consistent with the eventual monitoring results. The controversy kind of turns now on what the impacts will be for fish levels and human exposures, and that takes a year or so to evaluate. I know my colleagues at Harvard are involved in follow-up monitoring work on that, so hopefully more data will come out on the biotic and human health side shortly.
All right, I have a question from Lori Oates, and then there's one in the chat. So Lori, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks, John. I previously wrote an op-ed for CBC that our leaders are assuming too much too fast on Gull Island. And I'm wondering if the panelists today have views on what can be done to prevent further mega dam development within Canada and within Labrador in particular. I mean, our leaders are very much talking about, there's been a lot of lessons learned from Muskrat Falls, so everything's going to be okay. We got to let go of our petulant nationalism with Quebec. Don't expect too much in 2041. So we're really being set up, I think, with these narratives that more of this kind of development is coming down the road. So I was just wondering if the panelists have views on that.
Does anybody want to take that one and run with it?
I'll offer a comment on it if nobody else wants to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know as much about Gull Island as I do about Muskrat Falls, but what I do know about it is that there is also seems to be no commercial case for Gull Island, no established market, nothing to do with this electricity. So one of the disturbing things I think about Muskrat Falls is that it shows us that these kind of commercial developments can develop without a market because they are designed to provide debt payments for investors rather than to generate saleable electricity in the market. The result of that is that the public body ends up having to pay for these things that might have no commercial future. It's a very dangerous kind of development that's happening to utilities everywhere, in which the revenue streams tied to them start to become of interest to investment houses. The nuts and bolts of how all of that will work in terms of commercial saleability of electrical markets and that kind of thing seems to matter less. And so Gull Island seems to exemplify all of that. No market for it. There is all of this power coming from Churchill Falls in 2041. Other people, such as in Maine recently, you may know, turned down a proposal for Hydro-Quebec to create a transmission corridor through Maine. So, there's less interest in these kinds of developments elsewhere. I mean, we might also think about the politics of long-term big hydro with complex distribution systems as well, which is one of the things that is at stake in Gull Island. Is that really the best kind of energy security development or electrical system development going forward in the future? We've seen in Muskrat Falls that a very complex distribution system makes us more vulnerable. Muskrat Falls was supposed to relieve us of the Holyrood hydro generation, the thermal generation station, but it can't because the distribution system is so complex that it threatens the viability for energy security. This is true of large hydro in general. So for all of those reasons, I think Gull Island is a concerning, disturbing development, and perhaps the lessons of Muskrat Falls are an important thing here, that Muskrat Falls is dangerous financially because it was allowed to develop without any kind of commercial market, because in the background were publicly controlled revenues. And that is ultimately what will be necessary in order to make Gull Island work. Just my thoughts about it.
And I will say one thing that if you haven't read the book, one thing the book does really well is it explains in very easy to understand terms why Muskrat Falls was such a raw deal, in the sense that investors, who are supposed to be the ones assuming the risk, right? Investing is speculating basically. Their return on investment is guaranteed, but it's really the ratepayers of the province that and I realized that I understand that the point was brought up, and I think it's very valid that the ratepayers, their perspectives maybe aren't as important as that of Indigenous people who are on the front lines of this development. But I just thought the book did an excellent job of explaining the financing behind the project. So a question for Justin in the chat. Can you, whoops, it just disappeared because somebody posted. So can you elaborate a little on some of the ways you might differently represent Innu sovereignty if you had to do it over again?
Yes, so that's from John Parsons, who was a columnist for the Independent at the time when we were covering Muskrat Falls resistance. I mean, I can't lay out a detailed approach, but one thing one of the big lessons that I've learned is that there has to be a critical eye to power dynamics, not only between settler or colonial governments and Indigenous communities and governments, within Indigenous communities as well, but not through the same lens that we would analyze or interpret power relations within our own communities, within settler communities and governments. And so I haven't really spoken to this before, spoken publicly about this before, but one thing I'm grappling with, and honestly, I'm not finished thinking about it, so I'm kind of feeling vulnerable, but when I was covering Muskrat Falls in the few years leading up to 2016, and also when I was on the ground there in 2016, I had a mentality, the settler journalist mentality of politicians versus grassroots people, or leaders versus people who they impact with their decisions. And I kind of applied that to Innu and Inuit leaders as well, without much experience, I would say, covering Indigenous politics. And so I was particularly hard on people like Peter Panashaway, Johannes Lamp, people who I would call up or email or, and demanding comment, saying like, your people are wanting answers, they're desperate, they're, and meanwhile, all of these folks who are now in leadership roles have been involved in the same struggle for decades. And it's not that there shouldn't be accountability for anybody who holds positions of power in Indigenous communities as well, but there are nuances and subtleties to covering stories like this that I think most journalists definitely don't have. And I mean, I've spent years thinking about it now, and I still understand that I have just a very kind of amateur understanding, I guess, an outsider's understanding. And so now that my understanding is developing, I can look back at the ways I handled certain things and kind of cringe at myself. And I wish I could go back and do it differently. And I will say, just kind of tying in, just kind of concluding my thoughts here, and tying it in with the last question about Gull Island. Well, it ought to be sort of at the front of any discussions of Gull Island, the fact that the Innu Nation has never ceded or surrendered their land, just as the Beothuk never did on the island of Newfoundland. And they have been forced into situations where they have to defend not only their sovereignty, but their actual lives and health and well-being and communities and children's futures against NATO low-level flying, against bans on hunting, and against large-scale hydro, which has been one of the biggest disruptors and dispossessors of their communities and their ways of life. And so the Innu Nation actually does have quite an important role to play in this. And it's not as simple as, are the current leaders going to concede to industry and government's demands and sign away their rights to Gull Island. It's not that simple, but I think that has to be a part of any investigation or consideration of Gull Island. But also, if I could go back and cover Muskrat Falls again, I don't know if I'm even yet ideally situated to do it. Ideally, we would have Innu journalists reporting for us and informing the rest of us. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Innu and Inuit, I should say. But I think I will go approach things with greater care and with greater foresight, and not just show up on the ground when there's potential for protest or conflict. I think relationship building is crucial. So I guess that's one thing I would say, and I have been trying to maintain and build relationships in the years since 2016.
Okay, thanks, Justin. We are running a tiny bit over. We did get a bit of a late start, partly because I had some technical difficulties, but I just wanted to ask Jessica, just as a last question, I was thinking during her presentation, and I think it's an important point to maybe flesh out, whether there's any, I mean, you brought up some of the health concerns, potential health concerns around different environmental health impacts of the dam. I was wondering if there was any convergence at all in terms of discussions in the region about the effects of climate change, which are, of course, being seen in Labrador. Climate change is happening everywhere, but it's really happening at higher latitudes. And I'm just wondering if there has been any convergence of discussions about Muskrat Falls and climate change, and understanding how those two might accentuate each other in terms of impacts on land users.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm thinking about quite a bit as I write my PhD thesis now. So a few different points on climate change have come up. First, of course, there's the cumulative impact. So people have been discussing how there are changes associated with climate change, which have been well documented in the region, but also the inability at times to differentiate potentially the impacts of climate change and the impacts of hydroelectric projects. So that kind of uncertainty there about what is causing what impacts, and the potential kind of cumulative effect of that. Also, I've had a few people mention to me how they think that the impacts of the Muskrat Falls project could be blamed on climate change by those in power, in terms of discussing how politicians might say, okay, actually, that's not the Muskrat Falls project that caused this problem, it's climate change. So a few different ways that climate change is brought into the conversation. So it's definitely something that's, I think, in people's minds as we think of these environmental health impacts, for sure.
And Ryan, you wanted to jump in on that? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, just speaking on behalf of my co-author, Amina Startup, who co-wrote the book chapter with me. She actually has a recent paper set in the Gulf of Maine that characterizes the relative impact of climate change on methylmercury accumulation. So the argument basically is that even though globally mercury emissions are decreasing, warming waters make the lowest levels of the food chain more effective at accumulating methylmercury that's in the water column. And so in many cases, even in places that are not affected by local mercury contamination, even though you would be expecting to see declining levels of mercury in the food chain, you're seeing stable or increasing levels based on the effects of climate change. And so there are modeling tools, some developed by my colleague Amina, that can help inform this conversation.
All right, we are probably past the point where we could reasonably go more overtime. I know people have got schedules and they've got to get on to things. If you do have a question, like a really burning question, because I know we had a good amount of time for questions, but people might have more, just shoot me an email and I could forward that to whoever on the panel might be willing to send you a written answer or whatever. Also, there's lots of answers in the book itself, and I'll do a plug for the book because I really love this book. I just thought it was amazing. You can order it if you are from outside the St. John's area at the Memorial University Press website. So just Google Memorial University of Newfoundland Press, and it's available for order right off that website. If you live locally and you want to support a local business, actually, the local carrier for the University Press titles is Downtown Comics, and so you can get this book, other great titles from Mun Press, and the latest issue of Spider-Man all in one trip, right? And so what could be more awesome than that? So I want to thank our panelists, Steve, Lisa, Neria, Brian, Justin, and Jessica. We've been working on this, pulling this together for quite some time, and it's great to see it finally come together. And I'd like to thank the audience for showing up. And so we'll wish you all a great day and a great weekend, which is almost upon us. And thank you all for coming and participating. Yay.
Thank you, John. Thanks for
Thanks.
organizing.
All right, take
Yes.
care now.